40 bullets, 40, in less than 60 seconds, 2 vehicles boxed him into a dead-end alley on the south side of Chicago and unleashed everything they had. The windshield exploded, the tires were gone, the entire chassis of the car was shredded like paper. Every single shooter standing in that darkness was absolutely certain they had just erased the most feared man in the city. They stood there watching the smoke rise, already celebrating. What they did not know was that Wallace Gator Bradley was already reaching for his weapon. He did not run. He did not crawl away and hide. The door of that destroyed vehicle swung open, and Gator Bradley stepped out of the smoke, bleeding from the shattered glass, eyes locked on the men who thought they had finished him. He advanced. He returned fire with everything he had, catching the hitmen completely off guard. The men who came to end his life panicked and fled the scene, leaving their tire marks burned into the cold Chicago concrete. But here is the real story. Most men who survived something like that would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulder. Most figures from that era ended up dead or buried under a federal sentence they would never walk out of. But this brother, right now, in 2026, Wallace Gator Bradley is still standing, still breathing, still operating not on the block, but in courtrooms, fighting multi-million-dollar legal battles and forcing the state of Illinois to answer for its sins. The same government that spent decades trying to lock him down watched him walk straight into the White House Oval Office, sit across from President Bill Clinton, and break down the raw reality of the inner city to the leader of the free world. Today, we are opening the full untold file of the man they called the urban translator, Wallace Gator Bradley. To understand why that name carried absolute weight on the streets of Chicago, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the 1970s South Side, specifically the concrete corridors of Morgan Park, where entire generations of young black men grew up in communities the American government had completely abandoned. There were no jobs, there was no infrastructure, there was no investment coming in from City Hall or Washington. What filled that vacuum was raw street politics, and out of that struggle, the Gangster disciples evolved into a massive, highly disciplined shadow organization with thousands of active soldiers stretched across the South Side. But an army without discipline is just a mob, and discipline in that world was enforced by one man. Wallace Gator Bradley was not just a prominent figure inside the organization. He was named the official chief enforcer. In the underground hierarchy of Chicago street politics, that title means you are the hammer, you are the final word. When the board hands down a decision and someone on the block refuses to comply, you are the one who goes to that block personally. Gator Bradley took that role seriously in a way that left a permanent mark on the entire South Side. During the peak of the Chicago turf wars, rival organizations were constantly pushing against the borders of Gangster disciple territory, testing the edges, looking for weak points. Gator was the answer to every one of those tests. Street archives from that period document brutal hand-to-hand confrontations where Gator personally broke the resolve of rival leadership right in front of their own soldiers. He did not delegate the dangerous work. He showed up himself, and when his car was spotted rolling down a block, rival crews cleared the corner without a word being spoken. His presence alone communicated the message. The real test of that enforcement role came in 1973, when the organization's founder, Larry Hoover, was hit with a 150 to 200-year sentence for a high-profile murder conviction and transferred deep into the Illinois state prison system. Law enforcement across Chicago immediately assumed the organization would fracture. Without its head, they expected the structure to collapse into internal warfare and dissolve within months. They completely underestimated what Gator Bradley was capable of. From inside his cell, Hoover needed an absolute executor on the outside, someone who carried enough personal credibility and raw authority to hold thousands of soldiers in line while the leadership was behind bars. He chose Gator. Coded instructions passed through approved prison visits, and Gator became the official extension of Hoover's will on the streets of Chicago. This is where the true scope of Gator's operation becomes clear. When internal factions decided that Hoover being locked away meant they could pocket organization funds or launch unauthorized side operations, Gator shut it down without hesitation. Authorities documented instances of midnight enforcement operations, elite squads moving through the South Side, seizing assets from rogue trap locations, and physically neutralizing anyone who tried to operate outside the sanctioned structure. If you took money that belonged to the board, Gator made sure that decision cost you everything. He kept a multi-million-dollar street economy running without a single structural collapse, all while the man who built that economy was sitting behind prison walls. The Chicago Police Department and federal investigators knew exactly who was holding the structure together. They saw Gator's influence in every major territorial shift, in every block that went suddenly quiet when detectives showed up. But Gator operated with a level of tactical intelligence that left investigators consistently empty-handed. Whenever a major confrontation went down and police flooded the South Side looking for witnesses willing to talk, they found nothing. Case files dissolved. Grand juries were left with hollow testimony. The streets understood a fundamental rule of that era: you do not cross the chief enforcer. Gator Bradley lived on a knife's edge every single day, running thousands of soldiers and evading constant surveillance, cementing a reputation as the most feared enforcement figure Chicago had produced in that generation. That reputation made him the most valuable target in the city, because every rival organization understood the same basic strategic reality. If you want to dismantle a structure, you cut down the man holding it together first. According to street accounts and neighborhood records, that boiling point arrived on a pitch-black winter night in Morgan Park. Gator was navigating his vehicle through a quiet corridor of the district when the headlights of two unmarked cars appeared in his rear-view mirror. Before he could react, both vehicles accelerated and cut him off simultaneously, boxing his car into a tight dead end with no exit. There were no words, no warning. The windows of the opposing vehicles came down in silence, and then the darkness erupted. The shooters opened up with automatic weapons, pouring a relentless barrage into Gator's vehicle. The windshield shattered in the first second. The body of the car was punctured from every angle. More than 40 rounds tore through the metal frame in under a minute, blowing the tires off the rims and turning the chassis into a smoking wreck. The shooters stood watching the carnage, convinced the job was done. They had no idea that the moment the first round cracked through the glass, Gator had dropped flat across the floorboards, using the engine block as cover while rounds tore through the seats directly above his head. When the barrage paused for a reload, Gator moved, the door swung open, he stepped into the smoke. He returned fire with everything he had, advancing on men who came expecting to find a body, and instead found a man coming straight at them. The ambush collapsed in seconds. The shooters panicked and fled, leaving nothing behind but burned rubber and the echo of the exchange fading into the Chicago winter air. Surviving that night made him a legend, but what Gator did the following morning is what separated him from everyone else who had ever worn that title. He knew immediately that an ambush with that level of precision, hitting the exact vehicle at the exact location at exactly the right time, meant the information came from inside the organization. Someone had talked. While the wounds from the flying glass were still fresh on his face, Gator moved. He locked down the entire Morgan Park sector and began a systematic internal investigation, deploying his personal circle to track the source of the leak. Street reports from that week describe a quiet, methodical purge across the South Side as Gator rooted out the elements responsible, sending a message that traveled through every level of organization. Without a single press release or police report, the local precincts went into overdrive. The exchange in that alley had pushed the city past a threshold, and tactical units flooded the South Side looking for any opening. They could not touch Gator for the shootout. No one on the block was going anywhere near a detective with information, so they changed the approach. They waited, they watched, and when investigators managed to tie Gator directly to a heavily armed robbery operation, they moved fast. A coordinated team of Chicago police cruisers and tactical officers surrounded his location and took him down before he could maneuver. Gator Bradley was arrested and hit with serious charges, carrying a heavy prison sentence. The state thought they had finally taken the hammer off the board permanently. They were wrong. What they did not understand was that putting Gator Bradley behind a wall did not end his story. It forced him to start writing a completely different one. Prison, for most men, is designed to accomplish one thing: isolation. Cut a man off from his network, strip away his influence, and watch his operation dissolve from the outside in. But institutions built for ordinary men cannot always contain extraordinary ones. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, the Illinois correctional system was becoming the unlikely birthplace of one of the most sophisticated strategic pivots in the history of American street organizations. Larry Hoover, sitting deep inside a state facility on a sentence that should have buried him forever, had spent years studying the organization from the inside out and arrived at a critical conclusion. Raw, visible conflict had a ceiling. Open territorial wars brought federal attention, mandatory sentences, and attrition that no organization could sustain indefinitely. The only path to long-term survival was a complete operational transformation. What emerged from those prison conversations was a document that would reshape everything, a strategic framework, the inner circle called the blueprint. The decision was made to legally rebrand the organization's public identity. The street name was formally dropped. The new public designation became Growth and Development. This was not a simple name change designed to confuse local precincts. It was a multi-layered institutional strategy built to move thousands of active members into legitimate social, political, and economic systems. Regional governors, local regents, structured neighborhood boards operating through community organizations. The entire framework was designed to function like a corporation on the surface, while maintaining the internal discipline that had always defined the structure underneath. A blueprint on paper, however, is worthless without someone capable of executing it in the real world. The organization needed a figure who had deep street credibility, someone whose history on the pavement was beyond question, combined with the intellectual sharpness to navigate political rooms. Without flinching, the mandate landed on Gator Bradley. When Gator walked back out onto the south side of Chicago after serving his sentence, he came out a different man on purpose. He publicly stepped away from the chaos of his earlier years. The street gear was gone, the tailored designer suit took its place, and Gator introduced himself to the city under a new professional title: Urban Political Consultant, Urban Translator, a man who understood both worlds with equal fluency and could translate the language of the trenches for people who had spent their entire careers in government buildings pretending the trenches did not exist. His first objective was to build a visible, legitimate community presence that would fundamentally shift how the outside world perceived the organization's membership. Gator established and anchored a series of grassroots community programs under the Growth and Development identity. These were not superficial gestures. They launched neighborhood clothing lines, including an operation called Ghetto Concepts, designed specifically to create legitimate employment for young men from the South Side who had no other economic pathway. They organized large-scale free food distributions that provided direct assistance to struggling families in communities that had not seen real government support in decades. They ran organized neighborhood cleanup operations and peaceful community rallies that drew thousands of residents. To the average family living on those blocks, this was not a criminal organization. This looked like the only institution in the city that actually showed up when things got hard. But the true depth of Gator's genius was revealed in the creation of a political action organization called 21st Century VOTE. This became Gator's primary instrument for reshaping the power dynamics of Chicago politics from the ground up. He understood something that most street figures never grasped. In America, the ultimate currency is not territory, and it is not cash flow. It is voting power, organized, disciplined, unified voting power. Gator and his organizing teams flooded the South Side with voter registration drives, unlike anything the city had seen at the community level. They registered thousands of young men and longtime residents who had never participated in a single election, men and women who had spent their entire lives being ignored by every candidate, came through their neighborhood asking for support, and then disappeared the moment the votes were counted. Gator changed that equation. He transformed a disorganized, disenfranchised population into a unified voting bloc that no politician in Chicago could afford to dismiss. The effect on local politics was immediate and jarring. Elected officials who had spent decades treating the South Side as an afterthought suddenly found themselves unable to win a single precinct without securing some form of alignment with Gator. Bradley's political operation. Candidates who had never once set foot in Morgan Park were now making the trip, sitting across from Gator in community center chairs, asking for his endorsement. The man who once ran enforcement on the city's most contested blocks was now running the city's most consequential voting infrastructure. This shift threw law enforcement into complete disarray. Federal task forces and local investigators had spent years building traditional racketeering cases around street-level activity, movement patterns, financial transactions, territorial disputes. Now they were watching the same figures they had been targeting organize peaceful political rallies, manage registered community nonprofits, and appear at city council meetings. Every time an investigator tried to connect the community operation back to underground activity, the organization responded with charity records, voter registration documentation, and political endorsement files. Gator had constructed a shield that the traditional law enforcement toolkit was never designed to penetrate. He had taken the tactical intelligence forged in Chicago's most dangerous decade and applied it to a completely different kind of battlefield, and he was winning. By 1994, federal agencies were experiencing a specific kind of frustration that comes from watching a target operate in plain sight in a way you cannot legally touch. The FBI and DA had spent the better part of 2 decades building comprehensive files on the Gangster disciples, labeling the organization one of the largest coordinated street networks in the country. But while their surveillance teams were still focused on traditional block-level intelligence, Gator Bradley was operating in corridors those teams had never been cleared to enter. The moment that broke every calculation came in the middle of 1994. Through his deep personal connection with civil rights leader Jesse Jackson and the massive political infrastructure he had spent years building through 21st Century VOTE, Gator Bradley didn't something that no figure from his background had ever managed to do. He secured an official invitation to the White House. This was not a public event. It was not a group tour or a ceremonial photo opportunity arranged by a congressional office. Wallace Gator Bradley, the man who had survived that ambush, who had run enforcement across the South Side for years, who had fought the legal system from every angle, walked through the security layers of the White House in a tailored suit and sat down inside the Oval Office directly across from President Bill Clinton. The historical weight of that moment is difficult to fully compress into words. Outside those walls, the Clinton administration was in the final stages of preparing what would become the most sweeping crime legislation in American history, the 1994 Crime Bill, a piece of federal law that would flood communities like the South Side with more police presence and impose sentencing structures that would lock up an entire generation of young black men for decades. Inside that same building, in the most protected room in the world, the man those very policies were designed to neutralize was sitting across from the president, making the case against them. Gator Bradley did not walk into that room with his hat in his hand. He walked in as the urban translator. He laid out the ground-level reality of the inner city with the authority of someone who had lived every inch of it. He argued directly that the federal government's approach to urban poverty was not a war on criminal behavior, it was a war on impoverished communities. He pushed for a different framework entirely: investment in local employment, community, controlled rehabilitation programs, and grassroots infrastructure funded by the same government that had spent billions on surveillance and incarceration without producing any measurable improvement in the lives of the people on those blocks. When the intelligence community and senior federal directors learned the details of that meeting, the response was immediate and furious. FBI leadership and Chicago law enforcement officials were stunned. The man they had considered a primary target for years had just sat in the Oval Office advising the president on the exact policies designed to address organizations like the one Gator had once enforced for. Media outlets across Illinois ran the story. Critics argued that the White House had legitimized a dangerous organization by allowing this meeting to happen. The community on the South Side saw it entirely differently. For them, Gator Bradley had done something unprecedented. He had carried their voice, their reality, and their ignored history directly to the highest seat of power in the world, and refused to be anything other than exactly who he was. He had outmaneuvered the entire federal apparatus, not with a weapon, not with territory, with strategy, credibility, and the kind of political access that no law enforcement file had ever anticipated he could build. The final chapter of Wallace Gator Bradley's story, the one still being written right now in 2026, is in many ways the most remarkable of all. Because while every contemporary from his era on the Chicago street landscape has either been lost to the pavement or consumed by the federal prison system, Gator Bradley is still here, still operating, still forcing institutions to answer for their failures. The arena has changed. The weapon of choice is now a legal argument rather than anything else. And Gator Bradley has proven to be just as dangerous in a courtroom as he ever was anywhere else. To understand the magnitude of his modern operation, you have to look at a specific case that unfolded in the Illinois court system. A Chicago man named Mark Maxson had spent 25 years inside a state penitentiary for a murder conviction he did not commit. 25 years for something he did not do. Clearing a wrongful conviction from the inside of the prison system is one of the most difficult legal challenges that exists in America. It requires institutional knowledge, relentless pressure on a bureaucracy designed to resist revision, and someone on the outside willing to invest years into the fight without any guarantee of a result. Gator Bradley took that case. For 8 years, Gator worked behind the scenes as an advocate and legal strategist, dissecting the state's evidence, mapping out the structural weaknesses in the original prosecution, and navigating the complex machinery of post-conviction law. He brought the same methodical precision to the legal system that he had once applied to the streets. And eventually it worked. The wrongful conviction was overturned. Mark Maxson walked out of prison a free man. The state of Illinois, forced to account for 25 years of wrongful imprisonment, paid out a settlement of $75 million. And then Gator Bradley did something that stunned the entire Chicago legal establishment. The moment that settlement cleared, he filed a lawsuit directly against Maxson, demanding $312,000, his compensation for 8 years of strategic advocacy and legal work that he argued was the direct reason Maxson was free at all. He walked into open court and made the case that his contribution to that exoneration had real, measurable value, and he expected to be paid for it at the level of a top-tier consultant. Legal analysts across the city were floored. Prosecutors who had spent careers on the opposite side of the courtroom from men like Gator Bradley were now watching him command the civil litigation process with a confidence and precision that most formally trained attorneys would respect. The man who once enforced discipline across a multi-million-dollar street economy was now fighting for his share of a multi-million-dollar legal settlement in open court using the very system that had once tried to permanently remove him from the equation. That legal battle is still unfolding. And even through that complexity, when personal tragedy arrived at his doorstep, Gator Bradley's response revealed everything about how completely he had internalized the transformation he had built his second life around. When his 72-year-old brother, James Kelly, was shot and killed on the streets of Chicago, the entire city held its breath. Everyone who knew Gator's history, who understood the depth of his connections and the reach of his influence, expected that loss to trigger a wave of retaliatory violence across the South Side. Gator issued a single, unambiguous directive to every faction with any connection to him: no retaliation. Stand down, let the legal system do what it is supposed to do. He used every gram of influence he had accumulated over 5 decades to ensure the community absorbed that loss without more bloodshed, and he turned the pressure back onto the police department and prosecutors to handle the case through the framework of the law. That moment, more than the White House meeting, more than the legal battles, more than surviving a 40-bullet ambush on a freezing Chicago night, is the truest measure of how far Wallace Gator Bradley traveled from where he started. Because the man who once believed the only answer to betrayal was to handle it in the streets, who built his entire legend on being the most feared enforcement figure in the city, chose a completely different weapon when it mattered most personally. He chose accountability. He chose the law. He chose restraint. In 2026, Wallace Gator Bradley stands as one of the most genuinely complex and unbroken figures in the entire history of urban America. He took the absolute worst conditions that the South Side of Chicago could produce in its most violent decade, extracted every survival instinct and every lesson the trenches had to teach, and spent the second half of his life weaponizing that intelligence against every institution that had written his community off. He survived what should have killed him. He walked into rooms he was never supposed to enter. He built political power from the ground up in neighborhoods that had been stripped of it for generations. He fought the legal system from both sides and is still standing when the fight is far from over. The men who poured those 40 bullets into his car on a cold Chicago night thought they were writing the final line of his story. They were writing the first sentence. Wallace Gator Bradley, the urban translator, and one of the last true legends still walking,